Thank you.
Hey everybody, welcome. We're just gonna let everyone get started on their Zoom stuff.
Yes.
Getting yourself settled.
And if you would like to, we always appreciate it when people put in the chat where they're calling in from today and maybe just a few words about how you're feeling today. And we will get started in just a minute. Okay, we have somebody from British Columbia, another person from San Francisco, Chicago, Athens, Texas. Okay. Awesome. Well, I'm gonna get things started. So welcome to Holding Space with Claire Bidwell Smith and Dr. BJ Miller. My name is Dara Cosberg and I am the program director at Reimagine. And as a nonprofit, we spark community conversations and experiences like this one that empower individuals, families, and communities to face the hardest parts of our existence, including illness and death, while inspiring people to celebrate life and one another. And I just want to start by thanking our sponsors. And first, with deep thanks, we want to acknowledge the generosity of the Memories for underwriting this work. The Memories is an online alternative to traditional obituaries that enables family and friends to share photos, quotes, memories, and condolences for loved ones who have passed away. To offer their support during this time, the Memories has made all life stories free to post. And for more information on creating a free life story visit, please go to thememories.com. And I'd also like to thank our rest of our festival sponsors who support Reimagine and make this work possible. I also just want to thank all of you, individual donors who also make this work possible. Everything working together helps us keep this going. So before introducing Claire, I just wanted to get everyone acclimated to Zoom. These are my cats, Sammy and Biscuit, and they're showing that you can turn on and off your mic, which we will be having a Q&A at the end, which you can share verbally or in the chat. And you can keep your camera off, but we recommend keeping it on as it makes us feel closer to each other. And feel free to just ask your questions as they come into the chat. And if the chat is distracting to you, you can always close it out by clicking the little X in the right corner. And with that, I would like to thank or introduce and thank Claire Bidwell Smith, who is an internationally renowned author, speaker, and grief expert. She's the author of 3 books of nonfiction, The Rules of Inheritance, After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? And Anxiety, The Missing Stage of Grief. With that, I will hand the mic over to Claire. Thank you.
Thank you, Dara. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am so excited to be here. For those of you who are new, I started holding these conversations in early April, shortly after the pandemic kind of broke out here in the US. And I just wanted to provide space for us all to come together and talk about everything that was coming up, and particularly around grief and end of life and illness. That has been the field I've been working in for the last decade, and I just know so many amazing people, and I thought I will just bring someone on every week and we will hold space for everything that people are feeling and thinking about, and we will answer questions. And it's been just an incredible experience. I was chatting on the phone with Elua Arthur last night. We were just catching up and she was like, man, how are you doing this every week? And I was like, I love it. I'm just really like, I love all your questions. I love the guests and the energy we bring. So today I'm super excited to have Dr. BJ Miller with us. Dr. BJ Miller is a longtime hospice and palliative medicine physician and educator. He's worked in all settings of care: hospital, clinic, residential facility, and home. His book, A Beginner's Guide to the End, was co-authored with Shoshana Berger and published in 2019. His latest project, Mental Health, aims to provide personalized, holistic consultations for any patient, caregiver, or clinician who needs help navigating the practical, emotional, and existential issues that come with serious illness and disability. Welcome, BJ.
Thank you, Claire. It's good to
Yeah,
see you.
you too. So I wanted to start with some personal reflections. I realized the other day that it's been 5 years since we met. I was working on my second book, which is a book about the afterlife, and particularly how exploring different views of the afterlife affect the grief process. I had been a grief counselor for about a decade, and I was kind of noticing that one of the things people experience in their grief process was this reckoning with their beliefs, their spiritual or religious beliefs about the afterlife, where their person has gone. And I was thinking about my time in hospice, and I had used all these tapes that a guy named Frank Ostateski had recorded. And he'd made all these tapes on how to train hospice volunteers. And I was like, you know what, I'm gonna look up that guy and the Zen hospice, and I'm gonna go and interview him. And I was living in Los Angeles at the time. And so I look him up, and he's not there anymore. And I look at the Zen hospice, and there's BJ. And so I send you an email, and I was like, hey, I'm a writer in LA. I would love to interview you about Buddhism and the Zen hospice and grief and the afterlife. And you were like, great, let's do it. Do you want to come up here in person or talk over the phone? And I was like, oh, you know what? I'll just come up there. I have some family in San Francisco. So I drove up there, and we met at Zen Hospice, and we had an awesome conversation, and we have been pals ever since. But in that time, I'm going to stop talking in a minute and let you talk, because I know that people are here to hear you talk. In that time, you have gone on to do so much in the last 5 years. TED Talks, Oprah, new ventures, just you name it. So I would love for you to tell us all just briefly your personal story, if there's anyone here who doesn't know your background, and then kind of where you are today and what you're doing now.
Sure. It's nice to see you. Well, nice to see everybody. I can kind of see a lot of people. And thanks, Reimagine, for having us. So yeah, Claire, gosh, it's funny you say that, because on one hand, I feel like, shouldn't it be like 50 years or something longer than 5? I feel like we've known each other a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad you came up that day. So, the way I got into this work was really through trying to transform my own grief, really. I mean, I had, there's a lot to say, but the big story is when I became an amputee in college from electrical burns. So some of you guys might not know this story. I was just screwing around on a commuter train one night with friends, and I had a metal watch on, and the electricity arced to the watch from the power lines. And anyway, I ended up losing both legs and one arm, or part of both legs and part of one arm. And that was a very, you can imagine, a very big experience. And it really opened my eyes in all sorts of ways. But really, that experience certainly acquainted me with my own death. That was a big part of it. It helped me really dive into loss, because it was just so overwhelming. It wasn't like I could distract myself from it. I had to deal with it. It was just too overwhelming. And that was a part of its gift. I couldn't get lazy. And loss wasn't an abstract idea that I was pondering as a college student or something. This was very visceral, very real. And it also helped me kind of make sense of my life before those injuries. I was 19, but I had grown up really a caregiver. My mother had polio and as a child, and then post-polio syndrome. And so really, since I was about 8 or 9, I was one of her main caregivers too. And so that's a big part of the story. And then a few years after the injuries, I lost my sister to suicide. And that also really, as you can imagine, blew open this subject for me. So, and somewhere along the way, I kind of noticed that as much sorrow or whatever that I was feeling or seeing or experiencing, one of the very interesting things that I realized was that and I've said this to you before, Claire, that I'll cry as much over lost keys or a wallet as I do lost limbs. Like it was just an observation. Like there was something generic about loss, period, big or small. It didn't much matter. And that was actually an important lesson, because I think one of the things we do in grief sometimes, and I'll shut up in a second, but one of the things we do sometimes is we compare our grief loads or our suffering loads. And that is so dangerous. And I don't know why my brain went right to that, but I guess it's I suppose it's because I want to make sure that we all know on this call together that, my story is sort of dramatic: suicides, lost body parts, dismemberment. If I'm not careful, I might make it sound like that I'm having an exotic experience. But my point is, this is an anti-exotic experience, an incredibly common one. Lost limbs, lost relationships, lost keys, whatever it is. And so I guess I end there just to sort of make sure we're welcoming everybody's losses here, big or small. Doesn't really matter.
I love that. I was just having a conversation with someone yesterday about just the idea of giving people permission to grieve. And one of the things that I've seen happening a lot during COVID is I was getting interviewed a lot in the very beginning by different magazines and newspapers and random stuff. And there was this big question that kept coming from everybody. Is it normal to be grieving right now, even if we haven't lost a person? That was what everybody wanted to know. Is it okay that I'm grieving my old life? Is it okay that I'm grieving a job I just lost, or that I'm grieving my kids being home? And so I often feel like my job is simply just to give people permission to grieve, because you're right. You can have a huge loss, but you can also have small losses and they're equally devastating to people in different ways, So I think that's a really important distinction you made. Thank you.
Yeah.
So tell us about your newest venture that you've just started, because I'm so excited about this.
Oh, me too. So together with my partner, Sonia Dolan, Sonia and I have been working together for about 4 years. We worked on the book together and have done this sort of public engagement, speaking circuit stuff and all sorts of things. And over the last several years, Sonia and I have been really trying to keep an eye on what do we do post-book? What's the next step? What does the world need? Where can we, what suits us? And we've had all sorts of ideas. We've gone all over the place. I mean, too many ideas. I was getting a little dizzying. But COVID really actually helped organize our thinking. And so we decided to get into the back to sort of direct service, direct support. Not me talking about it or teaching about it or something like that, but actually doing this work. And that has felt really wonderful. But let me just back up. So mental health, it's a place, like you described it very well. It's a place you go to get extra support. It's all online. You don't need a doctor's referral. It's, you just schedule anytime you need a little extra support. And we are staffed by palliative care clinicians, doctors, nurses, social workers, chaplains, all that good stuff. And we mean to sort of we're a non-medical service deliberately. So I'm not becoming people's doctor through mental health. It's more like we are here to help counsel and coach people to use the resources they have, versus become yet another layer on the pile of multiple doctors, et cetera. And so that's what we're doing. And I don't know how long in now, maybe a month or so since we've gone live. It's very much a work in progress. We got the site up as quickly as we could just to be responsive to the times. And people are coming, and it's delightful. And I just love it. I had shut down my clinic at UCSF to make space to do this. Mm-hmm. I realized over the years, whether it's a friend reaching out for help or a friend of a friend or a stranger who's just lost, or I'm sitting in clinic at the cancer center at UCSF, I realize I'm having many of the same conversations. And a lot of the work ends up being around identity and existential issues and loss and how to reconcile, how to cope, how to keep yourself while you're changing yourself and all that good stuff. I'm so happy to let go of some of the medical piece. It's really fun to work around the medical piece. We can talk more about that. But anyway, that's a down and dirty on mental health.
No, that's awesome. It's so important. I think now more than ever, people just don't know where to turn for stuff like that, and doctors don't even know where to send people or how to answer a lot of these questions.
Right.
And I was the caregiver to my father when he was dying, and my mother had already died of cancer. And I just remember as a family going through so many times when we just didn't know if we were making the right choices, how to figure out if we were, who to talk to. And so I think that something like this is so valuable. And I have so many clients who've lost a loved one that they were caring for and went through a lot of the same stuff. They just didn't know how to make the right decisions. And so it seems like mental health is something that can really fill that void and just, help figure that out.
That's the idea. Yep.
Tell me about the difference between hospice and palliative care and like kind of how people navigate that world, because I know that's something that you've done a lot of.
Yeah, good one. That we can't, that distinction can't be made often enough. I think more and more people have heard of palliative care, but many, or maybe even most, still presume that palliative care is end of life care, is synonymous with hospice, is all about death. And of course it's not. Even if it were about death, it's never just about death. But palliative care, so just to kind of, to level set, palliative care is essentially in the context of serious illness, and serious illness is left deliberately vague. It doesn't, there's not a qualification per se, but it's not, you don't necessarily reach out to a palliative care team if you broke your ankle, for example. So within the context of serious illness, palliative care is just simply the interdisciplinary pursuit of quality of life. And if you have to frame it in sort of in the negative, you could say we're here to treat the problem of suffering, and that's actually kind of useful because in contrast to the rest of medicine, which is really there to treat your disease, palliative care comes along and tries to pick up all the other pieces that make up a person or a family and to treat those. To treat the person, not the disease. And that might sound a little tidy, but that's actually very true. So that's palliative care. And it grew up, it's growing quickly, not quickly enough, but it's growing quickly. It grew up in the 1990s, mostly in hospital settings, but increasingly you'll find palliative care clinics like the one I worked at UCSF, palliative care, home-based palliative care programs, web-based palliative care programs like mental health. So it's spreading out. But that was another driver for mental health, was palliative care is very well represented in certain places and totally lacking in other regions, especially like the Southeast, for example. So to make it available online was a real impetus to kind of help plug those gaps. Anyway, so that's palliative care. Hospice is a subset of palliative care. It's a more narrowly focused type of palliative care that is really focused on the final months of life, final year-ish of life. And hospice is a subtype of palliative care. It gets really tricky around the language when we say someone's on hospice. What does that mean? Because hospice now is an insurance designation. So that has as much to do with how it plays out as the philosophy of care. So you qualify for hospice if you have 6 months or less to live. You qualify for hospice if you give up pursuing curative treatments and things like that. So there's some forks in the road to go on to hospice. It's an amazing thing when you're ready and when you qualify, but there's some hurdles to jump through to get there. Whereas palliative care is irrespective of death. You might have a week to live, you might have a decade to live. It doesn't much matter, and it's available to you anytime. You can be going for intensive, aggressive care right alongside palliative care.
So let me ask you this. I worked in hospice for 4 years, and there's so much beauty and so many benefits to it. And same with palliative care. I mean, it's really, so much of it is about honoring, what a person, their quality of life, what they want when they're ill or when they're dying. How do we reconcile that philosophy and those things with what's happening with COVID patients right now, who are not able to kind of have that same experience, right? They're alone in hospitals. Their loved ones can't be with them. They're FaceTiming if possible. Their hospitals are overrun and overworked. How do we talk to me?
It's very tricky. I mean, one of the things that COVID, for decades now, for a long time, we've been, the way we die as human beings, especially in the Western world, is increasingly from chronic illness. So you and I are much more likely to get a diagnosis that will kill us eventually, but with which we'll live for many, many years. It used to be, of course, that the death was a more spontaneous act because medicine didn't have much to offer. But now we can help people survive certain things that would have killed them. So a lot of our language, a lot of the book that Shoshana and I wrote together, a lot of it sort of presupposes this chronicity to it, that you're going to have this protracted relationship with your diagnosis and with your death. Now, COVID's come along and kind of reawakened this much more acute death, even in folks who are otherwise healthy. So that changes the mindset, and it doesn't give us this sort of protracted period where we get to wrap our heads around things that may be hard, but we can kind of sit with it. Can we roll around with it? Can we can move into hospice when we're ready? We can pursue treatments until we're ready to shift, et cetera. So versus now, there's not much time to do all that. So that's a big feature here. And then I would also say that, as you point out, the way we're now isolated from one another, it has a huge impact on how this plays out, just the experience of it. And so these are big stressors. There's a lot to say, but I'd say one takeaway in terms of how to navigate this moment is, this is sort of a plug for advanced care planning in a way. Yeah, this now to really actually take death seriously, and the idea that you could go at any time and do your advanced directives, name your healthcare proxy, say what kind of care you'd like to have if you can't say for yourself, etc. So now's a very good time. That's a very healthy response to the moment. And even more specifically, if someone knows they're sick already and possibly laboring with illness and may be exposed to COVID, before engaging the medical Megillah, the huge thing that goes with that, it's a great time to elect hospice if that's what you want to do. So you can if that's where you want to head and you've got a serious illness, you might make your first call might be to a hospice agency right now and circumvent the hospital, because you can really get stuck in a hospital now. Mm-hmm. So that advice is maybe a little faint, because there's few of us who are both living with chronic illness at a point where death is imaginable, and where we might have COVID coming our way, and we can think and respond to it by not going to the hospital. That might be asking a lot, but it's one thought of very few right now to how to kind of navigate this. Does that make sense, Claire? I don't know.
No, it definitely does. Talk to me about how we can understand and just wrap our heads around people dying alone. Your experience that you had with your accident and you being a patient and the suffering you went through, and then your work as a physician, but also in hospice, you have sat bedside with people who are dying. I'm sure you have seen them die. What I experience on the other side of grief counseling is people coming in and just feeling so much remorse around their loved one. They are so consumed with the idea that their loved one suffered at the end, that they went through a lot of pain and suffering or fear or whatever it was, and it takes them a long time to sort through all of that, and they're holding it. And so one of the things that I always think about, you and I have had some beautiful conversations about, sometimes we the living suffer more than the dying, is kind of what I've taken away from some of the conversations we've had. And I was wondering if you could speak to that, if there are people out there right now listening who have a loved one in the hospital who is alone, or have recently lost somebody who was maybe alone when they died. How can we kind of rearrange our thinking about that?
Yeah, it's an important one. So I think a couple thoughts. One is, and also kind of on the heels of your last question, another really constructive response to this moment is, and as we've seen folks at the end of life, it's very, I struggle with this. I'm really good at appreciating things once I've lost them. So now's a really good time to check yourselves, look in your gut, try to make this sort of idea of time and finitude actually real in your viscera, and feel it, and get to work appreciating what you have while you still have it, and the relationships you have while you still have it. So it's a little more related to your last question, but otherwise moving forward, I think you put out your finger on something that's really, really key, is in a couple ways. Even under the best of circumstances, I think, one of the things we do as humans, we're in a tough situation, and it's so easy to imagine, gosh, if only I could be there with grandma or with whoever. is dying, and then everything would be better. You know, it feels like it's the linchpin. That's the thing we're missing. And if only this would darn COVID weren't happening, we could see each other, then everyone would be great. Oh boy, no, no, no. So let's really just be careful about level set of what you're comparing your situation to. So one is try to push back on that thought. The fact is death is filled with all sorts of things you can't control. And we're always left, the survivors are always left to string together a narrative that includes all these variables that are completely outside of our control. Mm-hmm. That's the power of this force, that it is bigger than we are. And that's its charm too. So that's a really, really key thing, to kind of watch your mind, and to, if you find yourself saying like, gosh, if only I could have been there, then everything would have been better. Then I would have had closure, blah, blah, blah. Nope. And closure, on that note, at least in my experience, that's a made up phenomenon. Mm-hmm. You can make a nice narrative that has a pretty bow on it, and you may feel sort of done in a way, but we don't have a natural right to closure. We create it, and I think it can be a very useful thing to create. But again, if you're looking for closure, you're always going to have a regret of, only I had said this or asked that, of why didn't I do that? And this is just one more thing on that big stack. So that's probably the biggest takeaway for me. I'll say one more thing, more practically speaking, for folks who have folks who are in the hospital or nursing home or otherwise out of reach. You know, one of the things that's really beautiful that happens amidst loss is we realize how much we need each other and how much we have in common. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, I think in the rest of life, we spend so much time on our differences. Loss, death, these are the things that come up, these equalizing forces that help us realize, holy cow, we're 99.9999% the same, you know, and we share these experiences, etc. So, on that note, you know, I've heard some really beautiful stories of friends of mine who are working in the hospitals, of families, some families who would practically try to beat down the door to get in there. And some folks even succeeded, or some hospitals have a policy where one visitor can come in for a few minutes. But the stories I've been hearing about those experiences, they end up adding trauma on it. You go into this very foreign world, everyone's gowned up, you've got a few minutes at the bedside to try to somehow make this all okay. You're separated by all this gear. And then you get whisked away. And oftentimes it's just even more traumatic to visit. Mm-hmm. Whereas I think one of the most healthy sort of practical things I've heard of is when a loved one phones in, you know, bellies up to someone on staff, whether it's an aide or a nurse or a doctor or a janitor or a unit, anybody inside. And you see if you can get a couple minutes and describe the person you care about in something more than human terms, and basically deputize or ask that clinician in the hospital to go act as your messenger. And even more than your messenger, act as a sort of conduit of love. Like my friend Mary Remington, who's a chaplain out east, she just, her job now is to go around loving people on behalf of these families, and the families can, and then she'll report back. She can picture this, and then it ends up being this beautiful bond with Mary, the chaplain. And then the families realize, gosh, we're all, this may make it sound too convenient or easy. I mean, it's still going to be hard, but the families realize the power of what's going on in the hospital with the clinicians and the work that they do, and that, you know, that they are filled with love too. They're not just technicians, et cetera. So anyway, that's one of those sort of responses I think is really, really gorgeous and of the moment.
Mm-hmm. I love that. So, you know, COVID has illuminated so many things, and just there's been so many new things that we've had to grapple with during this time. And I think, you know, on top of the same conversation that we've been having just now, people are grieving in isolation, and they're sorting through all these things, or they're trying to care for a loved one remotely and going through this. You know, when I was going through the death of my mom 23 years ago, which was the first really big loss that I went through, there wasn't anything like there is today, you know? And I'm grateful now that there are so many places we can turn, especially virtually. What are your recommendations for people who are feeling alone right now, or grieving alone, or trying to sort through all this stuff that we're experiencing?
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple thoughts. One is we may be physically alone, but in so many ways, we are emotionally tied in this big existential crisis moment. One of the things that you and I see with clients and patients, of course, is existential crises, loss come along, they're hard as hell, but also all this beautiful growth can happen. All these lovely things can happen with support and time. Whereas now, wait, where was I just going with that? Anyway, lost that train of thought. This happens to me at least once an interview or meeting. Anyway, what was your question, Claire? Can you remind me your question?
You know, like where can we turn right now and how can we kind of bolster each other and
Yeah.
those kind of people who are feeling alone right now that don't need to be, because I think there is a lot out there.
Yeah. So, okay, thank you. So one is the idea that maybe practically alone, but in some ways we are never more united. The idea that we're all going through some loss at the same time is a really big deal. Again, usually it's one person, one family at a time. And one of the great refrains, the heartbreaking refrains is you feel how lonely they feel, like they're the only one going through this hell. Right now, we're all going through some variation on that hell. So on some level, I just want to say, we may feel alone, but it's maybe nice to remember right now, we're all scraping the barrel on some level. And therefore, there's a potential for us to find a new level of empathy that could be really, really potent coming out the backside of this. It may be too soon to celebrate that. So that's one sort of reframe I want to get to. And then the other thing, well, speaking of is we are coming up with really beautiful ways to be together. Technology is enabling them. Our visit right now, reimagine as a backdrop underneath this, the monthly vigils on the 9th of every month, the monthly vigils around loss and grief are beautiful ceremonies that anyone can participate in. So there, necessity is the mother of invention. There's really beautiful things happening right now, albeit from some distance. And I guess I also want to pause on that moment too. And as beautiful as this, tech has never shined better in some ways. But I also think it's really important we remind ourselves that while, you and I are kind of looking at each other in the eye, Claire, and I see you, we're in real time, that's amazing. Yeah. But let's not confuse that with what it's really like to be in each other's company, to smell each other, to see each other's little subtle movements and all that stuff. So I just want to make a plug. Let's use what we have. And right now we have the digital space in new ways. It's amazing. But let's also, speaking of loss, remember that it's not the same thing as being together. Let's not confuse the two. And in this way, if we can kind of remember the analog world and the aesthetic world and the touch and all that, because there's gonna be a time again where we can touch each other, and I can't wait. And we want to make sure that we keep that muscle sharp and that we can have the receptors to experience what that marvel of being in each other's company. So I want to hold both of those things and not pretend that this is just the same as being together, because it's not.
I think it's such a fine balance. I agree. I think we have to not let go of the idea that we're going to be together again at some point. But I think we also really need to turn towards support that we can find right here, right now. I think people who are grieving in isolation or people who are having virtual funerals, whatever's going on, I think we have to lean into the support that is available. And I think we have to get creative. I love the idea of the vigils that are happening, because we can't go and we can't gather and we can't do the things that we normally do that are ritualistic, but we need to still be doing them. So I love that this is an option. I want to ask you one more question, then we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. You guys can put things in the chat bar. You can start putting them in now if you have questions for BJ, things you want to hear him talk on. But BJ, since we talked in early April, one of the big things that's come to light during COVID, that hadn't quite come to light at the time that we talked, and that's the racial disparity that's going on in healthcare. And it's been so just profoundly kind of exciting to really blow open that door and start talking about it on such bigger levels. I had Pastor Corey Kennard on, what was that, Dara, a month ago. We had some amazing conversations. Mm-hmm. Even last week, 2 weeks ago, I had Jason Rosenberg on, who's an author, and his wife wrote that famous op-ed in the New York Times that was called "You Might Want to Marry My Husband." Mm-hmm. And he has now gone on to write a book and do all kinds of things. But one of the things I said to him, I was like, Jason, you are a white man, just as you are a white man, BJ, and I'm a white woman, and I want to acknowledge that. But sorry, Jason Rosenthal. One of the things I was thinking about was if a woman of color or just any woman had gone through what Jason went through, I don't think there would be men lining up the way women have lined up for him, and I think just kind of thinking about this privilege that certain people are in, thinking about what other people are going through that they don't have, and especially just what's happening with healthcare and COVID right now, and racial disparity. And I was wondering if you've had any thoughts on that since we last spoke.
Well, I feel it all unfolding, as we speak. And I think one of the tricks for all of us is I'll speak for myself, is to not jump too quickly to summary or silver linings or summary statements. How this is what we've learned. I'm still really feeling a bunch of this stuff, and I'm letting myself be changed. I think that's one of my favorite responses to grief and loss and suffering in general is, let yourself be changed. I think it's really one of the sweetest things we can do for each other. And that's where we get to find our adaptations and our creative work and all sorts of things, and how many different lives we can have in one life, how many different ways we can be, how much there is to learn, how much we don't know. And so I'm sitting with all that, and high on that list, thanks to a movement like Black Lives Matter, thanks to people pointing out to what's been right under my nose for as long and longer than I've been alive. Here we are having epiphanies when large chunks of the population have been, where have you been, guy, on some level. So I need to acknowledge that. But what it's doing too is it's kicking me into learning mode. And learning mode is one of the sweetest ways to metabolize, to deal with grief, is to be taken down to the studs. Pretending I've got all my shit together and know everything is just impossible right now. So great, drop the facade and see what's coming up. See what there is to learn, because there's a ton. And I think, it's interesting to have a social justice moment right alongside a pandemic, a sort of a public health crisis.
Yeah.
You might think, gosh, what a weird coincidence that two major sort of forces would bubble up at the same time. Well, of course, they're related somehow. And that's something I'm kind of trying to ponder. And how are they related? Why is one bringing up the other, or vice versa? I don't really have an answer for that, but it seems to have something to do with us actually looking at ourselves more deeply.
Mm-hmm.
One of the ways that we've traditionally dealt with death is we don't look at it. Keep on moving, kind of distract ourselves. Similarly, I think one of the things we do when we experience differences among each other, among ourselves, and we run into people who actually have it harder than we did, even if we've been crying all morning about how hard our life is. And very often we might go, and sort of project some things on them and not let ourselves look. And so right now we're letting ourselves look because we have to. And that's the thing. I think there's some thread here around fairness. I'd really love to see the voices around disability rise up right now. It's not just simply, the differences among us aren't simply cultural or racial, but yet another systematically marginalized portion of the population is the disabled community. Mm-hmm. And many of us don't think of disability in terms of civil rights. So we're on our 30th year of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's a very interesting anniversary. So anyway, I'm going on and on here. So I don't know, I could kick it back to you and also the group too. I'm just sort of free flowing some thoughts on this, but I would love to hear from folks how we think these two moments are related, because I think there's something vital in there.
Yeah, I think curiosity right now is so important. Curiosity about other people's experience, about how this has happened. But I think COVID, while incredibly painful and terrible in so many ways, is also going to end up having so much positive change, change to our healthcare system, change to our, our systems, our administrations, the way that we look at, racial disparity in healthcare. Just so much has been illuminated, and I think it's going to be some really amazing opportunities.
I agree.
I want to answer some of the questions here, or ask them. So Judith says, I run an 18K breast cancer group, all ages and all stages. Fear of reoccurrence is really present for them. Suggestions on what they can do not to live in fear that hasn't happened, of something that hasn't happened. How do you work with patients with that?
It's a toughie. You know, this is, it happens a lot. So I'm just speaking, nothing specific of what I'm saying right now is specific to COVID. But one of the things I've seen clinically a lot, and it's come up in Metal a few times too, is, you know, folks will go into remission or somehow they've gotten better. And everyone thinks, oh gosh, congratulations, you beat this thing, or whatever it is, you know, or something that's meant to be celebratory. And very often the folks, in their private moments, or when they'll come into my office, will say, God, I know I'm supposed to be celebrating this, but actually I feel terrible, you know, for a number of reasons. I got used to being a patient, and now I'm supposed to go back to this old life, but I don't feel like that old. I don't want to go back to the way I was before this diagnosis. I can't go back. And so it can be actually a weirdly lonely, surviving can be its own kind of loneliness. I remember I had that experience after my injuries. I felt like I went to some mountaintop or to some depths that I didn't have really great words for, but I knew as I was re-entering the world, I was supposed to be excited. I'd survived, I'd graduated and all that stuff, but I was not. I actually remember this feeling like the world I just saw and I got to learn something about and got to glimpse doesn't jive well with the day-to-day life out in the world. And I had to kind of check myself. I had to kind of I had to let go of some things and smear these new parts of myself back to the old part, just so I had something in common with people. Anyway, tangent. Sorry about that. But I think right now, so first, I guess the big point would be to normalize that anyone who survives something or has treated cancer, specifically say breast cancer, it's extremely normal to not only not be celebrating that win or however it's framed, but be terrified that the next time I sneeze means the cancer's back. Right now, the next time I sneeze, I may have COVID. The next, you know, it can in the hypervigilance that goes to living with these things, you have to unpack that. So I realize I'm not answering the question. It's sort of leading up to it, and I want to normalize it, but how to deal with it? Well, I think one thing that comes up with folks I work with is to remind them all that they've already done. Like, you are here and you're stronger. You just learned a ton of stuff. That stuff will serve you. It's not going to go away just because the cancer went away. Part of the residue is that you've learned some stuff. So have some faith in yourself, have some confidence in yourself, because you've already done it on some level. That's a really huge reminder that needs to come up again and again. So anyway, that's a big thought. And then my last thought on top of mind for now would be, you know, fear. If you were paying attention, we should all have a pretty long relationship with fear, you know, and I've had patients who've asked me to help them become unafraid of death or unafraid of a recurrence. And invariably, I have to say, I don't know how to do that, but we can learn how to live with fear, like make peace with it. Quit trying to push it out of your life. It's like the diagnosis. Quit, like once at some point, it's you, it's part of you. Fear is very normal. I think it was Pema Chodron said, fear is a very natural response when you're coming closer to the truth, or something like that. I think that's very beautifully put. So let the fear, roll around with it. Don't try to kind of get it out of your way. Hug it, grab it, roll around with it. It's in you. See what what are you afraid of? What are you afraid to lose? Maybe that's a backward way of telling you what you actually love and what you should be appreciating, etc. And so I've worked with folks who never get over their fear, but they kind of right-size their fear. It becomes an old companion that they recognize and aren't so whipped around by. It's just something they recognize. Oh, I'm afraid. It's that fear thing again, you know, and then they get to be more than their fear.
I agree. I don't think we can ever really get rid of it altogether. I think you're right that we have to learn to make friends with it. Uncertainty, you know, you and I talked about uncertainty in April, and everyone going through COVID right now is, talking about living with all this uncertainty, but we're always living with uncertainty. It's just illuminated right now that, but it's always there. We never know if we're going to get up tomorrow, COVID or not, cancer or not, we don't know. So really kind of learning to live with that, getting comfortable with that is what it's about. There's a great question here. From Caitlin. She says, BJ and Claire, what are your thoughts about patients working with psychedelic medicine at end of life? Canada has just granted compassionate access to 4 individuals to allow them to use psilocybin mushrooms. Do you believe this is a revolutionary tool?
But do you want to go first there, Claire?
I don't. You're the doctor.
Well, I can't think of any sort of therapeutic thing that's come along in my career that I'm more excited about. It's the data are stunning. And it's addressing issues that we otherwise haven't really had much to do. So if someone comes to me, let's say in the past, and says, hey doc, I'm afraid to die. Well, like we just said, I can help them kind of maybe have a relationship with that fear. And if they're still gripped with that fear, I can put a wet blanket on them with some Ativan or Valium. I can distract them maybe with some talk. But we have not had a way to directly address the sort of root of what's so terrifying. What is the dynamic that is gripping this person? And the psychedelic experiences that are coming up have helped people in one session come out absolutely losing their anxiety around death, feeling connected to the world in new ways, even sort of feeling like death is in its place, part of life, not the end in some important ways, being turned on by mystery rather than cowed by it. These are folks these are not thrill seekers who are sort of, fudging it so they can get into these studies. These are people who really have dealing with some serious issues. One guided session within some integration work afterwards can last for many, many months. It's astounding. It's like changing your substrate. I like to think of it as like as a way of practicing falling apart. It's because we all fall apart. That's part of the deal. This body ain't gonna last forever. My ego ain't gonna last forever. We're falling apart all the time, and you can actually. It's like a skill. You can get good at falling apart because that's this discombobulation. Well, then you kind of take yourself down, then you've got all this raw material, you get to rebuild yourself. You get to kind of create with your life in new ways rather than feel yourself as this fixed thing that's just in decay. It's much more nuanced and subtle and gorgeous than that. And psychedelics seem to help us patch into that native ability. I'll just say one more thing on it. I think we also have to have a lot of respect for these drugs. Some of us were around for the 60s, and those of us weren't know some people for whom these drugs sent them down a very wrong road. So these drugs are to be respected. There's something very important about set and setting. These sessions are with psychologists who are trained to guide folks. Very importantly, there's an integration experience afterwards where you talk about what you went through and try to bring it back into your daily life. So let's be really respectful of these drugs. And also especially the ones who've been around for eons, from indigenous cultures. And, there's a lot of structure around these drugs because they're so powerful, and you need to respect them. So don't treat the subject matter lightly, and don't treat these drugs lightly. But with that caveat, I am thrilled for this development.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I don't know enough about it as you do, or as much about it as you do, but I've read one of the articles that everyone's citing here in the chat, the TRIP treatment, shared some really amazing findings and data. And for someone like me who works with people constantly in grief and anxiety, if there's something that can help alleviate that isn't a wet blanket like Ativan or Xanax or whatever it is people just take, if there's some way that they can really come to a new understanding about their existence, their mortality, embrace death in some way, I am all for it. But I will leave it up to you physicians to figure out how to respectfully and best explore it. Brad Wolf has a great question. He says, BJ, some people say death doesn't scare them. What percentage of patients have you seen who feel this way? Does death scare you? Are you afraid that you will be afraid?
Mm-hmm. Good question, Brad. I think, well, this highlights one of the things you mentioned earlier, Claire. It sort of gets on this, the idea that that death is often much more scary a proposition for the people who have to keep living. When I think about a lot of the people I've worked with, and it's not, I don't mean this as like, that's my effect, just support and time and palliative care and hospice work. By the time we're actually standing at our horizon and death is real, not some abstract idea, maybe most people I've ever worked with, by the time it actually comes, they're ready to go one way or another, in so many important ways. That's a huge generalization, but the fear seems to fall away. Maybe death is just so obvious. Maybe they can feel it coming. Maybe they're so uncomfortable that death is even welcome now. Whatever it is, it's a lot hard. In so many ways, death is harder to imagine than it is to actually be doing, from all that I've seen. And that jives well with what we know of human nature. I don't know about you. I would so much rather be in something difficult than know something difficult's coming, because the thing I imagine is almost always worse than what it actually feels like to be in it. So just check your imagination and know that you're probably more afraid than you need to be, or more freaked out than you need to be. But with that caveat, and I have this little, I don't think I'm afraid of death after all this thinking and talking and teaching and being with others and what I get to see. I don't think I'm afraid of death, but I don't know. It's still an abstraction to me. So when I'm actually, like I say, standing at my horizon, I absolutely reserve the right to freak the fuck out, like to really lose it, to be terrified, to just go, clawing back. Who knows? So I reserve the right to do that. As I sit here today, I don't think that will be my way out, but let's find out.
Doesn't Ram Dass talk about that after he had a stroke at one point? He when he was speaking after that, he would say that when he had that moment of the stroke happening, he actually felt panic after all these years of kind of talking about, just being at peace with things. And then the stroke happened and he completely panicked, which I love, that is human. We don't know.
Yeah.
I think for me, one of the things I think about is less fear of being dead and more, for me, it's a fear of leaving behind loved ones. Like my biggest fear is saying goodbye to my kids, or my husband. And like, that's what I'm afraid of. I'm not afraid of being dead or what death, the physicality of it, at the end, but I'm afraid of just saying goodbye to the people I love. That's my biggest fear.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I am trying, there's so many great questions. I'm trying to get through some of these, but people are pretty excited about your bedhead, BJ. Just want to point that out. Your COVID hair.
This is my COVID hair. I come out of the shower looking like this. So if I were in a tuxedo, this is how I would look. But thank you.
Let me see. Does anybody want to come on video and ask BJ anything directly? You can just wave your hand or come on. It's always fun to kind of interact with people.
Well, and while we're waiting, I want to just kind of pick up on something you just said, Claire, which I think is really telling and important, but also gets at the sort of developmental aspects that death can promote in us. If you start looking at death, like the body as ours dies, but it's still hosting all sorts of other little critters. And you leave it alone, it dissolves into the ground and becomes other things. I mean, there's proof of immortality all over the place. Actually, it's just not necessarily immortality of the ego. So one of the great developmental things around death is to get beyond yourself. Sort of remind your comment about missing your children, your family. You're already there. You're invested in others in all sorts of ways. And I hear the sorrow in that, but there's also this important developmental aspect for all of us. The ego is a thing that's really going to suffer around death. The rest of us, life's going to keep going. It's so funny, this phrase, end of life. It's really, I can't remember where I heard this, but we use this end of life phrase a lot. Well, no, it's end of my life. Life's going to keep going. We're really talking about the end of a life, my life. And even that, start looking, it's my ego, the I, the me thing. So before our deaths, and the folks that I've seen be really at peace at the end, sad, but at peace perhaps, are the folks who found their way to get beyond themselves. Not forget themselves, work through themselves. You still yourself too, but be more than yourself, be more than your ego, care beyond the four walls of your body. That is probably the most adaptive response to death I've ever come across, and one of the great opportunities for us. So if you want to get ready to die, think about the world beyond yourself.
Yeah. How do you feel about assisted death?
I'm
not sure we've ever talked about it.
Yeah, it's funny. When you said that, I had that same thought. It's a big and important subject. I think now maybe it's up to 8 or 9 or 10 states that have laws on the books. I can't recall. Compassion and Choices is the organization I know that is probably most involved and invested pushing this legislation at the state level. So I push you guys to that website if you want to learn more. But, it started in 1997 in Oregon, the Death with Dignity Act. The Supreme Court, there was a big Supreme Court moment around this subject, and the court kicked it back to the states. So states can vote to make it legal to end one's life, for doctors to prescribe medicine to end somebody's life. It's a huge, on some level, I think well, hey, it's my life. If I'm done, then that's my prerogative. And there's a very American, an autonomy thing. And that makes some real sense. And again, you're talking to someone who's lost. My sister chose to leave the planet. She made that choice. Mm-hmm. And it comes with a lot of baggage that way, especially for those of us left behind with guilt and what did we do wrong, et cetera. But in this context, death with dignity and laws like it, we're calling it assisted dying. We're calling it aid in dying now because it's different. It shouldn't have that baggage of suicide. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily a pathological, to be done with this life is not a pathological thing. I don't think you're necessarily depressed because you're ready to die. So there's a lot of reframing that goes with this law. Ultimately, I think it's, not that many people end up using it. And one of the important lessons from the States is that a big chunk of the people who get the prescription for a lethal dose of medication don't end up using it. And so it kind of points out that the therapeutic value of it is that, is we're imagining this future hell. You've got this thing in the medicine chest, like a parachute, a way out if it gets too bad. But oftentimes people don't end up using it. And I think that's really telling and really important. Anyway, there's a lot to say about it. That's
a big question.
It's a big one. We can go on with it if you guys want to, but I think in answer to your question more narrowly, as a physician, I am glad to have that power. I'm not glad to have the power. My patients have been glad. A handful of my patients have been glad that I have that power, mm-hmm. because before the law, I would be sitting there with lethal medications, access to lethal medication. Mm-hmm. People would be begging me now. And I'd have to sit there and go, sorry, I'm more invested in your living than you are. And that just has felt more perverse than a law like this.
We have like 2 minutes left, but we have 2 questions. Margaret wants to ask a question about attachment, and Ken has raised his hand. Maybe we can kind of squeeze these in these last few minutes that we have. Margaret, do you want to come on?
Yep. Hi, BJ. I'm Margaret. I'm a chaplain, and I just want to say, listening to you talk about end of life, I totally agree. And when you said my sister chose to die, I think of it as being differently abled, because some people in the last moments of their life, meaning weeks or days or months, have the ability to choose. And some people, their bodies don't allow it. So it's almost like a differently abled body needing some support around letting go. Because some people, I've watched many, many people choose when they die, but I just wanted to share that. My question about attachment is that when things are going well for me in my chaplaincy, I don't feel a lot of attachment to people staying alive. And it's very alive in me, even with my own family members or friends or loved ones who are approaching death. And I know that's uncomfortable for people who are very attached to people staying alive. Mm-hmm. And so just as a chaplain, if you could talk about how that can be difficult at times where my lack of attachment, which isn't always, but it's often, is kind of in conflict, and I want to respect their place around how they are attached to life.
Yeah. Well, gosh, there's a lot. Thank you, Margaret. And it's there's a lot to say. Where my mind went is that when I hear you, I'm reminded how important it is to get beyond the either or thinking. Like we're either attached or unattached, or that there's this very sort of one-to-one language. If I'm attached, I love you. If I'm unattached, I don't care. Or, you know, these sort of way oversimplified notions. And the truth is, as most of us, maybe all of us come to learn as adults, I think it's almost a hallmark of being adult, is you got to be able to sit with multiple things at once. Even things that appear to, excuse the noise, even if things that appear to be in conflict. So that's one thought, is I think a lot of the things that appear to be opposed, oftentimes that's just a problem of our language. It's not the problem of what the language is trying to describe. So that's a thought, and I think there's a lot more to it. I think, you know, it would be interesting, Margaret, if you wrote or talked to people about how related your love of life is to not being attached to it in any one manifestation. That those two things, assuming, looking at your smile, are deeply entwined. And I bet you could teach a lot of folks a lot by describing that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thank you. Ken, do you want to ask your question and then we will wrap up? We're already a little over time. BJ, do you have time to get to this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what I was going to say is I'm involved with a lot of near-death experiences and being at the bedside with people and trying to, when people are getting ready to make a transition, trying to acknowledge whether or not they're getting the visitation from the other side. Because we know many times, although we think they're hallucinating, they're getting visits from the other side to escort them to make that transition and to ease the loved ones that are behind, to say, hey, they are not dying alone, even though during this COVID thing, we seem to be separated physically from our loved ones. The other side is still visiting them if they're open to that idea. And, you know, the near-death experiencers have tried to make it easier for people to accept the death and not be so afraid of it. And BJ, you had a heart attack at some point, right?
Well, I guess the electricity stunned my heart. So my friends found me. I was either having a fluttering heart or the heart was stopped, which is pretty common with an electrical injury. But then you essentially defibrillate yourself with all that energy running around your system. And again, I'm really sorry for the noise back there, guys. I hope you can hear me.
Right.
But, you know, Kent, you bring up, you know, one of the things I hear your question, your comment really as a really important reminder to all of us, like we're trying to get to know death in some ways in our conversation, no grief, no loss. Which,
exactly.
You know, but part of knowing all this includes knowing that you don't know, you know, knowing mystery,
Exactly.
and or even not just not knowing little subtle clues in our guts, little voices that we override all the time, you know. And so I think I hear your comment, Ken, in reminding us to keep a really vastly open mind at this, on this. And I think there's something to vibes and to thinking about each other. Even though you and I aren't in the same room, Kent, I think if you're thinking about me on some level, I almost feel like I could know that, you know. We are connected in ways we do not see, we can't describe. Science doesn't have all the answers. So
and I also remind people, even after people have made their transition, when we're stuck in grief, we're not open to the signs that people are giving us once they've transitioned, that they're still around to watch us.
Yeah. Well, I've heard a lot of folks who are in grief who do get those signals, whether it's a dream state or a vibe or a feeling. And sometimes I'll get asked as a doctor, as a person of science or some such thing, like people ask me, oh, is that real? Did my sister visit? I don't know. Yeah, sure. If it was real, you felt it. Let's presume it's real. I mean, what a comforting thought. What a beautiful thought. And isn't it amazing to let yourself kind of imagine a world that you can't see? And
when you're grieving, you want to be comfortable, even though the person physically isn't there. You want to be comfortable remembering the good times, remembering the tough times you're having, and to share that just talking out loud to the person. Because I remember when my girlfriend died, the toughest part was trying to sleep at night.
Yeah.
You know,
Well,
after the busyness was done, when people would try and keep you busy.
yeah. Yeah. Right. Distracting you from the very thing that would make you feel better. I mean, with good intentions. But, you know,
Exactly.
I have to say, like, I learned this lesson personally, and I don't mind sharing the story. When my sister died, I had absorbed this idea of grief as something to kind of blow through, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, get back on the horse, essentially pretend nothing happened. You know, that's just crazy because it's impossible, but just stupid, frankly, because by doing that, I blew past all these signals of ways I was still connected to Lisa, even though she wasn't here. And I was ignoring those signals because I was ignoring the whole subject, and I missed out on all sorts of connections. I've revisited that, but yeah.
That was the thing, is my girlfriend died in January '69. It's been 51 years, but I realized I didn't even work on it till 1985 when I realized I never finished the grieving process. In '69, there was no place to go. Even in '85, there was no place to really talk.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until I started working on myself in '86 that it made it easier to start talking to other people. I know in '69, I felt more comfortable going to funerals than I did going to weddings.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you guys, this is a perfect segue. Next week, Kent, thank you I love that you brought up this connection that we always have with our loved ones. It's something I'm always talking about, something I feel like is such a necessary part of grieving, of saying goodbye, of end of life. You know, I don't think that we're ever fully gone from our loved ones, and I don't think we ever fully separate from them. So next week, a friend of mine and BJ's is going to be on the show. Her name is Fleur. She's a psychic medium. Whether or not you believe in it, we're going to talk to her all about, you know, what does it mean to stay connected to our loved ones? Is it real? How does it work? How can we do it for ourselves? You know, but Fleur, you know, BJ, you know Fleur, so she's great. She's I think she's going to bring a really interesting conversation to this. Dara's going to send a follow-up email to everybody here today with a recording of today's conversation. If you missed any of it, or if you want to share it with anyone, it will also have information on how to get a hold of BJ, how to get a hold of me. But BJ, thank you so much. This was amazing. How can we find you? And do you have any last words for us?
Come visit us at mentalhealth.com. Otherwise, we have a little Twitter account at BJ Miller MD, and I think we have a Twitter Mental Health, or is that through me? I don't know. I'm sorry. Gosh, Sonia's gonna finish me. But at least Twitter at BJ Miller MD, and just come visit us at Mental Health. You can reach out to us through that site too. And I guess my last word is, I mean, one of the great things about all this subject being more up for us all is we get to come out of the closet as loving each other, and that's it. You know, that's not soft, that's actually hardcore, and it's amazing and tough and vulnerable and strong as hell and blah, blah, blah. So I'll just say that. I love you guys. It's very nice to be with you, and thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to Reimagine for making all of this possible and holding space for everything. Thank you, BJ. I hope to hug you again in person one day.
Yeah.
I can't wait.
Yes. Well, thank you, BJ. Thank you, Claire. You can tell that everybody was just kind of like freaking out in the chat with just joy and love towards this conversation. So I really do appreciate you taking the time. And I just want to note for anybody who's interested, I just put a bunch of links in the chat, and we will also include for upcoming events, both for holding space and also our dose of togetherness on Monday and upcoming vigil and art responder events. So please go and check those out. And also I'm going to put a link if you are inspired today to donate to Reimagine to help keep these program going. That's awesome. Even $5 makes a huge difference. But thank you again for creating this wonderful experience for all of us.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Thank you.